Fourthian Club, and I'm sure the word Fourthian isn't in everyone's vocabulary. Uh, she has a son, Frank Riley Jr., who lives in Madison with his wife, Kelly, and their two red-headed children, Alan, 16, and Julia Lee, 14.
And Julia Lee's sitting over
And
against
Julia
the
Lee
wall.
is sitting right over there, the little red-headed girl. Our other esteemed reviewer is Jo Mark. She was born and raised in Russellville, Alabama, and she graduated from Russellville High School and from there went to the University of Alabama, where she graduated with a BA degree in history and a teacher's certificate in secondary education. She enjoyed teaching for 30 years. That is quite an accomplishment. And the last 23 years she taught at Tupelo High School. She taught various social studies classes, mostly United States history. In 2007, she retired and enjoyed spending leisurely time with her family and friends, working in her yard, reading, playing computer games, and piddling. On a more productive note, she has enjoyed being a member of the Fourthian Book Club. Uh, It's a wonderful club. She has volunteered at Good Samaritan Clinic and the Tree of Life Clinic and Meals on Wheels, and she is a member of the Gumtree Art Guild. She is a member of First United Methodist Church and has participated in numerous activities there. She was married to the late Jess Mark, and together they raised three children. She has three wonderful grandsons ranging in age from 18 to 23, and a precious 4-year-old granddaughter. That is Jo Moore. And now Beverly Clement McAlilly. Beverly will complete her 35th year as Director of Music Ministries and organist at First United Methodist Church in Tupelo. Beverly's a native of Pontotoc, and I was telling her I think Pontotoc is a music mecca in North Mississippi. She received a Bachelor of Music and Organ Performance from Millsaps and a Master of Church Music from Scarrett College in Nashville, Tennessee. And upon graduation, Beverly returned to Mississippi and began her work at First United Methodist Church, where she currently oversees, and this just wears me out, 4 children's choirs, a youth choir, 2 handbell choirs, and the chancel choir, as well as engages church instrumentalists and pianists in a variety of services and programs. We're so fortunate to have you here. Beverly has served as organist for United Methodist gatherings on the state, regional, and national levels, and is a longtime member of the Fellowship of United Methodists in Music and Worship. Beverly was honored to serve as National President of the Fellowship of United Methodists in Music and Worship. She has accompanied choirs for such well-known conductors as Andre Thomas, Mac Wilberg, and William P. Carroll. On a local arts level, Beverly is a member of the Tupelo Symphony Orchestra Board of Directors and previously served on the Tupelo Community Theater Board, where she held the office of Secretary, Vice President, and President of the board. In earlier years, she was a frequent performer on the TCC stage, and I remember Showboat was wonderful, and served as musical director for over 20 productions. Oh my goodness. But anyway, Beverly is married to Steve McAlilly. Welcome, Beverly, to Luncheon with Books. And I'm going to let you have this, like I said, reception.
Well, first of all, we're glad you're here. Joe and I have sense enough to know that you really came to hear Beverly sing. And we just happen to be a part of this production that has been done. So thank you, and we hope you enjoy it today.
Jane and I decided that a good way to begin our program is to tell you how we came to select the book that we did, which is Something Wonderful, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution. last year, about this time, I was coming back. I was on the highway coming back from Atlanta, I guess, and I always tune in to public radio. I enjoyed their programs. And I happened to hear a program called Fresh Air. Some of you may be familiar with it. Terry Gross is the host of that show. And she happened to be interviewing Todd Purdum, who had just had this book released just a month before. I found it fascinating. I've always loved the musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I found out a lot that I didn't know for sure. And they would play music from the cast albums. And so Jane and I, if you haven't heard earlier, are members of Fourth Young Book Club. So anyway, we happened to be on the book selection committee. And so in my mind, I'm thinking this would be a great book to review. So when I got home and our committee met, I told them about this book and said that I thought that it would be an interesting selection. And they agreed that it would be, and Jane was assigned the program.
Okay, Joe has told you why we chose this book. Now let me tell you how we're going to review it for you today. We thought about the program that Joe had heard on the radio, and so we decided, well, we would try to do something similar to that. And so we thought we would use the radio program format, like she heard on NPR, as a vehicle for presenting our book today. Hence, we decided to use the interview format. And so you see, here we are. I'm Mr. Purdum, and Joe is the interviewer, Terry Gross. First, let me tell you just a little bit about the author, Todd Purdum. He was born December the 13th, 1959 in Macomb, Illinois. Was a graduate of Princeton University in 1982. For a few years after graduation, Purdum was associated with the New York Times, first in Los Angeles, and then from 1992 to 97, he was in the White House as correspondent for the New York Times. He is now contributing editor for Vanity Fair magazine, as well as a senior writer for Politico, which is a very popular political journalism company now. Excuse me. He is married to Dee Dee Myers, and that name may be a little familiar to some of you. She served 2 years as former President Bill Clinton's White House press secretary. She and Mr. Purdum have 2 children, Stephen and Kate. Now, back to our book and Joe.
Our book today, Something Wonderful, was published in April of last year, and it's about these 2 men and how they came to have such a wonderful partnership in creating all of these musicals, including Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, The Sound of Music, and even more than that. If you'll think about it, I would dare venture to say that probably everybody in this room has been to a live production of one of these musicals. Maybe not on Broadway, but on a high school stage or at TCT, where Tupelo Community Theater has, if I'm not mistaken, presented all of the ones that I just mentioned, wonderful productions. And they continue to be revived. In fact, Carousel had a revival on Broadway last year. So these musicals have staying power for sure. Okay, now we're going to forget Joe and Jane. I'm Terry Gross, and by the way, Terry is a woman. You may not know that. If you've listened to Fresh Air, you know that she is. I looked her up. She's 68 years old, and she's been doing this for about 40 years. And she does a lot of research. So before she ever interviewed Todd Purdum, she had read his book, and she knew a lot about him, so she knew how to ask good questions. So, welcome today to Fresh Air. Our guest today is Todd Purdum, who is the author of our new book. Mr. Purdum, before there was a Rodgers and Hammerstein, there was a Rodgers and Hart, Lorenzo Hart, Larry Hart. What happened to this partnership that had gone on for so long?
Well, they had been partners and friends for more than 2 decades. But as 1942 rolled around, Larry Hart was increasingly falling prey to a problem that had plagued him for many, many years, and that was severe alcoholism. And he really was almost completely dysfunctional. He did not want to work. He told Rodgers that he wasn't much interested in working on adapting a play called Green Grow the Lilacs, which is what became Oklahoma. He wanted to go off instead to Mexico, where he drank so much that they had to sort of pour him off the train onto a stretcher when he got back to the United States. So it was really a tragic moment in their long friendship.
So when Hart didn't stop drinking, then Rodgers approached Hammerstein?
Yes, Rodgers asked Oscar Hammerstein if he'd consider collaborating with him because he thought that Larry Hart was falling apart. And Hammerstein said, well, as long as Larry can do the work, you have to stay with him because it would kill him if you left him. But if Larry cannot do the work, I'll be there. And that is what happened.
Mr. Purdum, with your permission, I would like to read a portion of your book that does a real good job, I think, of comparing and contrasting these two men who have become so famous. As collaborators, they were a conundrum. They had much in common. Both had been born in the same swath of what was then upper middle class Harlem. And by the way, they were both born in New York City. Oscar was the older. He was born in 1895, and then Rodgers in 1902. But they were both born in New York. Both attended Columbia University, where they were members of Pi Lambda Phi fraternity, and fell under the spell of the college's musical comedy troupe, the Varsity Show. Both had had unhappy, even miserable experiences working in Hollywood. Both grappled with bouts of depression, though Rodgers' problems were far more severe and enduring, and both preferred New York to Hollywood. Both were married to women named Dorothy, who were both interior decorators, though with wildly different tastes and styles. Both were the keenest of businessmen. Dick loved money more than anybody I've ever seen, except Oscar, the costume designer Lucinda Ballard would recall. Oscar's nature was that he was really stingy, and yet Oscar was the most lovable person I almost never knew, and Dick really was not. Neither particularly fancied nightlife. Indeed, in their sober suits, they could have passed for bankers or lawyers, or, as Groucho Marx put it once, a couple of chiropractors. The 18 years through ups and downs, they maintained an unbroken public front of unity, harmony, and calm. In our collaboration, Mr. Rodgers and I have no definite policy except one of complete flexibility, as Hammerstein would write in the preface to his collected lyrics. The truth was far more complex. The two men only rarely worked in the same room, with Rodgers preferring to compose at his Manhattan apartment or Connecticut country house, and Hammerstein writing at his farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, or in his Manhattan townhouse. Rodgers was prolific and lightning fast, while Hammerstein might labor for days or weeks over a single lyric before sending it off for Rodgers to write the tune. So I think this gives us a good idea of what these two men were like. Okay, back to our interview. Mr. Purdum, initially there was a lot of skepticism about Rodgers and Hammerstein working together.
Yes, even though the two men had known each other and worked together before, there was almost a superstitious feeling on the part of the people in that business, that anyone who had worked with one man for 24 years, as Rodgers had with Larry Hart, simply couldn't hit it off with a brand new partner. But they did. Their first collaboration was Oklahoma, as you heard, based on the play Green Grow the Lilacs.
Oklahoma was considered a breakthrough. In what way, Mr. Purdum?
Well, for one thing, almost all musical comedies of that era opened with big choral numbers to take care of those folks who were latecomers to the play. They'd have a display of beauty across the footlights with dancing girls and boys singing a big ensemble number. But Oklahoma began with a single woman on stage churning butter and a cowboy singing off stage in the wings. And it was very quiet. It was so quiet that it landed like a bomb, but it was revolutionary. Nobody could believe that a musical comedy would open in such a naturalistic way. Audiences during World War II appreciated and needed a simple and genuine topic. Then the story proceeded to unfold, and the story is very simple. As I said, it's about which of two guys is going to take a really pretty girl to a party. But it involved real characters and real people with real emotions, and not some cartoonish figures that were strung together just as an excuse for having wonderful songs. And then it did another thing, which was that it used dance, and particularly the wonderful ballet of Agnes de Mille, as a way of propelling the story forward, of exploring and explaining the characters' innermost thoughts and feelings and fears. And it wrapped this all up in one package that just felt completely unlike anything that had ever appeared on Broadway stage before. Oklahoma was received in 1943 the way Hamilton is received today on Broadway, as something really radically new in the theater, a revolution. A favorite song from Oklahoma is "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning."
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. Oh, what a beautiful day.
Carousel was the second musical that Rodgers and Hammerstein produced together. A beautiful song from this musical is "If I Loved You." Stephen Sondheim, who was mentored by Oscar Hammerstein and considered him a surrogate father, called "If I Loved You" probably the singular most important moment in the evolution of contemporary musicals. Why did he think that, Mr. Purdum?
Well, in the show, "If I Loved You" is set in the middle of an extended scene of spoken dialogue, sung dialogue, and the purely sung song. It's known as the bench scene. It's when the hero of the show, Billy, the anti-hero, Billy Bigelow, the ne'er-do-well carnival barker, is falling in love with Julie Jordan, the mill worker. And they're both instantaneously attracted to each other. But they're too awkward. They don't have the words to admit it or to express it. So they sing this love song in a conditional voice. And what the effect of that is that in these 15 or so minutes of the scene, they're falling in love right in front of the eyes of the audience. And by the end of the song, by the end of the scene, we can feel it. It's extremely naturalistic, but it's also almost operatic in its impact and in its emotional power. People in the audience almost feel like they're eavesdropping on Billy Bigelow and Julie's most intimate conversation and experience the emotional tug as well.
If I loved you time and again, I would try to say all I'd want you to know. If I loved you, words wouldn't come in an easy way. Round in circles I go, longing to tell you, but afraid and shy. I'd let my chances pass me by. Soon you'd leave me. Oft you would go in the midst of day. Never, never to know how I loved you. If I loved you.
Mr. Purdum, you point out in your book that the love between Billy Bigelow and Julie was strong, but not perfect. In one of the scenes, Billy strikes Julie, which I'm sure was as shocking to the audiences in 1945 as it would be today. Clearly, Rodgers and Hammerstein did not shy away from uncomfortable topics, and I want us to get back to that a little later in the interview. Why, Mr. Purdum, did Rodgers say to the end of his life that Carousel was his favorite show?
Richard Rodgers said, I think it's more emotional and I think it has more to say about human relationships. I think Carousel is the best score that we have ever written. I just like it better.
Perhaps the most famous song from Carousel, and one that remains popular even today, is You'll Never Walk Alone. Irving Berlin compared its emotional power to the 23rd Psalm. When a gravely wounded Army lieutenant named Bob Dole struggled to recuperate after World War II, the only song that gave him comfort was You'll Never Walk Alone. More than 60 years later, when Barack Obama became the nation's first African-American president, the opera star Renee Fleming sang the same song at his inaugural concert. And if we lived in Europe and were really big soccer fans, we would know that it has become the favorite game day anthem of soccer. So now we'll enjoy You'll Never Walk Alone.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a
what came next, Mr. Purdum?
Let's move on to South Pacific, the third of our musicals. It was the third collaboration of Rodgers and Hammerstein. In 1947, a new book called Tales of the South Pacific was written by a Navy veteran turned writer whose name was James Michener. He gained much attention in New York musical theater circles. This book was a loosely linked collection of the 19 short stories based somewhat on Michener's naval assignment in the South Pacific during World War II. Famous Broadway director Josh Logan was convinced that Tales of the South Pacific would make a fabulous Broadway musical if he could convince Rodgers and Hammerstein to write the music and the lyrics. And so, the rest is history. Fabulous Broadway star Mary Martin was cast as Navy nurse Nellie Forbush, and Ezio Pinza, the beloved Metropolitan Opera basso, became Emile Debec, the courageous planter on the island where the play is set. Three other characters of importance in the story are U.S. Navy Lieutenant Cable from mainline Philadelphia society, who falls in love with the beautiful dark-skinned girl, native girl, Liat. And then there's that lovable other character, a native busybody woman named Bloody Mary. Racial and cultural differences abound in this story. In fact, Rodgers and Hammerstein were not afraid to tackle sensitive issues in their plays. Oscar Hammerstein, in particular, made a point of trying to combat prejudice in his works. In 1949, he and his wife, Dorothy, joined author James Michener and another Bucks County, Pennsylvania neighbor, the renowned Arthur Pearl Buck, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Good Earth, in helping to create Welcome House, the country's first interracial international adoption agency, begun with the particular mission of placing Amerasian children, many of them illicit offsprings of broken wartime romances, into American homes. So let's listen to the beautiful Some Enchanted Evening from South Pacific.
Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger, you may see a stranger across a crowded room, and somehow you know even then, that somewhere you'll see her again and again. Some enchanted evening, someone may be laughing, you may hear her laughing across a crowded room, and night after night, as strange as it seems, the sound of her laughter will sing in your dreams. Who can explain it? Who can tell you why? Fools give you reasons, wise men never try. Some enchanted evening, when you find your true love, when you feel her call you across a crowded room, then fly to her side and make her your own, or all through your life you may dream all alone. Once you have found her, never let let her go. Once you have found her, never let her go.
Mr. Purdum, you just mentioned that Mary Martin was the female star of South Pacific. Then she later starred in one of the most familiar and best loved of all of Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals, The Sound of Music. Why don't you tell us about this 46-year-old that came to play young Maria in the Broadway musical?
The convention of theaters back then was that many times older actors and actresses often portrayed younger characters. And so Mary Martin had trained for this role like a fighter. She took Pilates classes, which were unheard of at this time by the general public, but then she had already been favored, but it had already been favored by dancers of that era. But Pilates was not known till a lot later to the general public. She worked out with a punching bag to strengthen her diaphragm and her voice. She was a mature woman playing the part of a young girl.
My day in the hills has come to an end, I know. A star has come out to tell me it's time to go. But deep in the dark green shadows are voices that urge me to stay. So I pause and I wait and I listen for one more sound, for one more lovely thing that the hills might say. The hills are alive with the sound of music, with songs they have sung for 1,000 years. The hills fill my heart with the sound of music. My heart wants to sing every song it hears. My heart wants to beat like the wings of the birds that rise from the lake to the trees. My heart wants to sigh like a chime that flies from a church on a breeze, to laugh like a brook when it trips and falls over stones on its way, to sing through the night like a lark who is learning to pray. I go to the hills when my heart is lonely. I know I will hear what I've heard before. My heart will be blessed with the sound of music, and I'll sing once more.
The Sound of Music was a particularly favorite musical of the American theater-going public. It was the story of the famous Von Trapp family of Salzburg, Austria, who fled their homeland in order to escape the Nazi regime, which was rapidly moving into Austria and that part of Europe. As I said, Mary Martin portrayed Maria on the stage, and Julie Andrews portrayed her in the movie version of the play. Much of the story of The Sound of Music revolves around the warm relationship between Maria, and the Von Trapp children. One of the memorable songs that Maria and the children sing is Do Re Mi. Would you like to sing along with Miss Beverly?
Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. When you read, you begin with. When you sing, you begin with do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do, re, mi. The first three notes just happen to be do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Come, I'll make it easier for you. Listen. Do, a deer, a female deer, re, a drop of golden sun, mi, a name I call myself, fa, a long, long way to run, so, a needle pulling thread, la, a note to follow, so, tea, a drink with jam and bread, that will bring us back to do, oh, 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 do, a deer, a female deer, re, a drop of golden sun, me, a name I call myself, fa, a long, long way to run, so, a needle pulling thread, la, a note to follow, so, tea, a drink with jam and bread, that will bring us back to do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So, do.
We've been talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein's hit shows, but they did have a few flops. Interestingly enough, while concentrating on their flops, they turned down what became My Fair Lady and eventually became Fiddler on the Roof. So you know their batting average was not perfect. During these flops and successes, Mr. Purdum, what was the relationship between Rodgers and Hammerstein?
It's an interesting question. Rodgers was in some ways the dominant partner in the relationship. His name came first, even though he was younger and had less experience. But it was Oscar who was the pioneer with the words, pushing the ball forward and breaking conventions. On the other hand, Oscar Hammerstein had had 12 straight years of flops before he and Dick teamed up, while he and Dick teamed up with Rodgers despite Hart's alcoholism, had really unbroken successes. So Oscar came in very self-consciously, even though he was the senior and older man, the more experienced man of the theater. He accepted his role as kind of a junior partner to Dick Rodgers as the price of having success again. And that fact seemed to color their entire relationship. They had tremendous professional respect for each other. They had terrific artistic collaboration and commercial success, but they were not personally close. And it is sad to think that each went to his grave not knowing whether the other person really had liked him or not.
They did have a 50-50 business relationship, and they formed a corporation under the advice of their accountant. Tell us about this business partnership.
Well, the important thing was they decided to do right from the very beginning, whenever they could, they wanted to own their own work and to own it outright. Both had been in the theater for a long time and had seen the way that creative people sometimes suffered at the hands of, shall we say, shrewd businessmen. So they decided, the two of them, that they too would become businessmen. They set up their own music publishing company so that they could own the copyrights in their songs. They did this very deliberately with an idea that these songs just might last. And indeed, they've lasted for 75 years. They're going to last until they go out into the public domain and are not copyrighted anymore. But in the meantime, Rodgers and Hammerstein made sure that they and their heirs, and now the companies that have bought the catalog of music from the families, are still making tens of millions of dollars every year from Rodgers and Hammerstein songs. Over the years, some important critics have had stinging words to say about the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein. But over the years, a look at the musical theater would prove them wrong. By 2006, the revolution in Rodgers and Hammerstein's reputation was so complete that when Andrew Lloyd Webber produced a revival of The Sound of Music at the London Palladium, the critical approval was overwhelming. Today, the sounds of Dick's and Oscar's music is as popular as ever, generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue. For example, on a single spring evening in 2014, there were 11 productions of Carousel, 17 productions of The King and I, 26 productions of South Pacific, 64 of Oklahoma, and 106 productions of The Sound of Music, all on a single night here in the United States.
One last question for you, Mr. Purdum. What prompted the title of your book?
The title of my book, Something Wonderful, comes from the title of the song, Something Wonderful, which is in The King and I, the story of an English government, Mrs. Anna, and her young son, who come to live and teach in the court of the King of Siam. Our last song is very familiar and happy song from The King and I.
He will not always say what you would have him say, but now and then he'll say something wonderful. The thoughtless things he'll do will hurt and worry you. Then all at once he'll do something wonderful. He has 1,000 dreams that won't come true. You know that he believes in them, and that's enough for you. You'll always go along, defend him when he's wrong, and tell him when he's strong he is wonderful. He'll always need your love, and so he'll get your love. A man who needs your love can be wonderful.
It's over. Our radio interview is now over. We are back to plain old Joe and Jane and Beverly. We'd like to close this session of Lunching with Books with a quote from the author, Mr. Purdum. The fabulous and talented Julie Andrews, star of Broadway musicals and Hollywood movies, shared the following statement regarding Rodgers and Hammerstein. Quote, they thought big and wrote about important, quite often uncomfortable themes. Bigotry in South Pacific, cultural and societal differences in The King and I, and the Flower Drum Song, which was brave and gave each musical a spine. Rodgers' music was always melodiously glorious, simple yet soaring, and Hammerstein lyrics were equally rich, brilliantly constructed, and so very well created. End of quote. Will people ever tire of the compelling stories and the glorious music that Rodgers and Hammerstein ever quoted? The evidence of the centuries suggests that many a new day will dawn, many a red sun will set, many a blue moon will shine before they do.
Many a new day will dawn, many a red sun will set, many a blue moon will shine before I do.
Gosh, dog.